Every Sunday morning, 10,000 people across Memphis, Tennessee, tuned in to hear one man speak. They trusted him with their grief, their marriages, their children. They trusted him with their money. That was the mistake, because while he preached about integrity from the pulpit, he was running one of the most brazen financial schemes his city had ever seen, and he almost got away with it. Welcome to Corporate Chaos Scandals, the place for the most shocking and unbelievable workplace confession stories. From office drama to hidden secrets, nothing is off limits. Before we get into this, make sure you subscribe and like, because we bring you stories like this every week. This is not just about one man's fall. It is about what happens when trust is abused and someone becomes untouchable. This is Omari Hightower's story, and it begins with what looked like a miracle. New Covenant Church began in a rented community center in South Memphis with 47 members, a borrowed sound system, and a 29-year-old pastor who preached like the words were coming directly through him rather than from him. That was 12 years ago. Today, and the numbers are not disputed, New Covenant is the fastest-growing church in Memphis, Tennessee, 3,400 seats, 2 Sunday services, both at capacity, a midweek congregation, a youth ministry with over 600 registered young people, a prison outreach program, a food bank that distributes to 1,100 families per month, a broadcast ministry that streams to over 140,000 subscribers online, and at the center of all of it, Omari Hightower. He is 41 years old, 6'2", the kind of presence that fills a room the way sound fills a room. You don't see it arrive, you simply feel it, and then you can't imagine the space without it. He dresses well, not extravagantly. The congregation knows this, appreciates this. A clean, fitted suit, nothing flashy. He speaks without notes. He moves across that stage with the ease of a man who has been comfortable in his own skin since birth. And when he talks, Lord, when he talks, he has a gift. This is not in question. Even the people who will eventually testify against him in a federal courtroom will say this, that whatever he did, whatever he took, whatever he lied about, the gift was real. He genuinely moved people. He genuinely helped people. He used to joke warmly to laughter that he drove a 10-year-old Honda to church every Sunday to remind himself and his congregation that he was just a man, that the ministry was bigger than him, that the money didn't flow to him. It flowed through him to the people who needed it. The congregation loved him for that Honda. It became a symbol. Our pastor doesn't live large, he lives right. They had no idea. Not one of them had any idea. On Sunday mornings, Omari Hightower parked his Honda Civic in the reserved space, walked into the building through the back entrance with a cup of gas station coffee, greeted every member of the church staff by name, and prepared to shepherd his flock. On Thursday evenings, he drove that same Honda 15 minutes across town, parked in the underground garage of a building he owned through a shell company, took the private elevator to the penthouse, and walked into an apartment worth $1.4 million. The apartment was registered to a company called Covenant Holdings, LLC. Covenant Holdings, LLC had a registered agent, a lawyer, not Omari, and its accounts were managed through a financial services firm in Nashville. The monthly maintenance fees, the utilities, the furnishings, all of it flowed through a chain of financial instruments that, to a casual observer, had nothing to do with a church in South Memphis. And it wasn't just the apartment. There was a lake house in Mississippi, also registered through a subsidiary of Covenant Holdings. There was a storage unit in East Memphis containing, among other things, 2 vintage cars, a 1967 Ford Mustang and a 1972 Chevrolet Corvette, both fully restored, both combined worth approximately $380,000. There were holidays, Ibiza, the Maldives, Cape Town, all booked through a travel account linked to a credit card tied to, and here is where it begins to get spectacular in its audacity, the church's general operating fund, flagged in the church accounts as pastoral development retreats. His annual church salary was $94,000, transparent, approved by the board, published even, because Omari had pushed for full financial transparency at New Covenant years ago. He had stood at that pulpit and said, "You should know where your money goes. Every dollar. I will never hide that from you." The congregation had given him a standing ovation. What the congregation did not know, what the board did not know, what nobody knew, was that over the preceding 7 years, Omari Hightower had quietly diverted approximately $2.3 million from New Covenant Church's tithing accounts into his own network of shell companies. $2.3 million over 7 years, from people who gave what they had because they believed in something greater than themselves. And he drove a 10-year-old Honda to make sure they never thought to look. To understand how Omari sustained this for 7 years, you have to understand how he built New Covenant's financial architecture. Because this was not a smash and grab. This was not impulse. This was engineered. When the church began to grow, really grow, around year 4, Omari restructured the financial governance. He proposed to his board of elders a tiered accounts system. The reasoning was entirely sound. A church of this size needed to separate its operational funds, its building fund, its missions fund, and its pastoral discretionary fund. Standard practice. Reasonable. The kind of thing any responsible growing organization would implement. The board, who trusted him completely, who had watched him build something extraordinary from nothing, who drove past that Honda in the car park every Sunday and thought, "This man is the real thing," approved it unanimously. The pastoral discretionary fund was the critical piece, designed on paper for mission trips, emergency community aid, and pastoral costs. In practice, for Omari, it was a reservoir. He controlled it with a single signatory arrangement, meaning only he could approve disbursements. He had convinced the board this was for agility. "When someone needs help at 2 a.m, I can't wait for a committee," he'd said. They had nodded. Of course. This man was at the hospital at 2 a.m. when your father was dying. Of course he needs agility. Over 7 years, he moved money through this fund in increments designed to stay below financial reporting thresholds into Covenant Holdings and its subsidiaries. He was meticulous. He was patient. He was, in the clinical language of the FBI agent who would eventually investigate him, one of the most sophisticated faith-based financial fraud operations we have seen at the local church level. He also, and this detail has been widely reported, tithed himself from his legitimate salary every month. 10%. He sat in the front row and put his own envelope in the plate. The congregation saw it every single week. The performance was total. Her name was Audrey Cole, and she was, in every way that mattered, the wrong person for Omari Hightower to have in his building. She was 53 years old, a certified public accountant with 28 years of experience, 17 of which had been spent doing financial audits for faith-based non-profit organizations. She had a reputation in the Christian accounting community for being thorough to the point of uncomfortable. She had once caused a small Baptist congregation in Nashville to completely restructure their entire governance model, and then sent the pastor a fruit basket with a note that said, "No hard feelings. Get it right." She was also, it should be noted, a deeply committed Christian woman who took her work seriously precisely because she believed that the integrity of the church was worth protecting. She wasn't a cynic looking for wrongdoing. She was a believer who understood that where there is money and trust, there is also the possibility of corruption, and that the best protection against that corruption was transparent accounting. New Covenant's board had engaged her independently, not at Omari's request. It was actually the associate pastor, a man named Brother Terence Ellis, who had quietly suggested to the board chair that a church their size really ought to have an independent annual audit. Brother Terence had raised it twice in 18 months. The second time, the board chair, a deacon named Raymond Foster, agreed. Omari had been informed. He had been entirely supportive. Accountability, he'd said. Exactly what we preach. He had also, in the 2 weeks before Audrey arrived, done a thorough review of his paper trail and concluded, based on 7 years of careful, incremental, legally worded documentation, that it would hold. He underestimated Audrey Cole by precisely the same margin that every man who has ever underestimated a meticulous woman has paid for. Completely. It took Audrey Cole 11 days to find it. Not the full picture. That took longer. But the thread, the single loose thread that, once she saw it, she knew she could not leave alone. It was in the pastoral discretionary fund, specifically, a pattern. Over 41 months, disbursements from the fund had been made in amounts ranging between $8,000 and $9,800, never above $10,000, consistently, predictably, like a metronome. The $10,000 threshold was not arbitrary. Above $10,000, financial institutions are required by law to file a currency transaction report with the federal government. Omari had stayed below it every single time. Audrey had seen this pattern before, once, years ago, a small Pentecostal congregation in Knoxville. The pastor had been structuring payments to avoid reporting requirements. The legal term for this is structuring. The colloquial term is federal crime. She did not go to the board immediately. She went back 3 more years in the records, then 5 more. She cross-referenced against the church's published annual reports, the transparent financial summaries Omari had insisted upon. She compared the discretionary fund activity against documented community aid disbursements, hospital visits, emergency family grants, food bank support. She built a parallel ledger. The gap between what the fund had received and what could be documented as legitimate pastoral expenditure was, after 3 weeks of meticulous reconstruction, $1,847,000 over 7 years. She sat with that number for a full hour. Then she called her lawyer. Then she called the board chair, Raymond Foster. Then, because she had done this before and knew exactly how these things needed to go, she called the IRS whistleblower office and the FBI's Memphis field office. She did not call the pastor. Omari noticed the shift before he knew what had caused it. He was perceptive. He had to be. It was fundamental to who he was, to his survival, both professionally and in this other, darker architecture he had built. He read rooms the way other people read text. He noticed micro-expressions, shifts in posture, changes in the temperature of a conversation. And in the week after Audrey Cole's call to the FBI, something in his building changed. Raymond Foster looked at him differently. Not with suspicion, Raymond was too composed for that, but with a quality of attention that hadn't been there before, like he was listening harder, watching for something. Brother Terence, who usually stopped in for a chat after Tuesday morning prayer, didn't come by. The accounting firm that handled the church's day-to-day bookkeeping sent over a junior associate to collect some additional historical records that Omari had always managed personally. And when Omari asked casually what they needed them for, the associate said, "Just routine supplemental documentation for the audit." He did not panic. Not yet. He had been careful. He had been thorough. He told himself this. He drove home in the Honda on a Wednesday evening, and he sat in the underground garage of the penthouse building for 20 minutes before he went upstairs. He sat in that car, that 10-year-old Honda that had become the emblem of his humility, the prop of his performance. And he thought. He considered his options. He could cooperate fully with the audit, demonstrate transparency, trust the architecture he had built. He could retain a lawyer quietly. There were people he knew, people he had helped over the years, who owed him something. Or he could do what every man who has built a lie tall enough eventually considers doing. He could run. He didn't run. But the fact that he considered it, sat in that car and genuinely weighed it, is the moment that identifies the point of no return. Because in weighing it, he had already admitted to himself what the audit would find, and what it would mean. The Sunday before his arrest, Omari Hightower preached on Ananias and Sapphira. For those unfamiliar, it is one of the most striking passages in the New Testament. A husband and wife in the early church who sold a piece of land, secretly kept a portion of the money for themselves, and then lied to the apostles and to God about the full amount. The consequence, in the text, is immediate and absolute. They fall dead. It is a passage about the cost of deceiving a community built on trust. He preached it like a man unbothered, like a man who had chosen that text from the full breadth of Scripture with no particular personal relevance to it. He was brilliant. He was moving. He called it the danger of a divided heart. He talked about how the love of hidden things corrupts the love of visible ones. He talked about how you cannot serve two masters. 3,000 people heard it live. 40,000 more caught the stream. Brother Terence sat in the front row, as he always did. He knew what was coming. He had been contacted by the board chair the day prior. He sat there and listened to his pastor preach about the cost of a divided heart, and he felt something he could not name. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something older and heavier than both. After the service, Omari stood in the lobby as he always did, shaking hands, hugging elderly members, kneeling down to the children, taking photos, being, in every visible way, the man they believed he was. One woman, a widow named Miss Patricia, who had been attending New Covenant since year 1, who had given her tithe faithfully every single month on a fixed income, who had told her grandchildren that Pastor Omari had spoken at her husband's funeral and given her a reason to get up the next morning, hugged him and said, "Pastor, that was the best sermon you've ever preached. God is really moving in you." He hugged her back. He told her she was an inspiration. He watched her walk to her car, and whatever was left of the man he might have been, in another life, in the version of this story where he made different choices, whatever was left of that man felt, in that moment, the full weight of what he had done. It was 2 days too late. Tuesday morning, 7:45 a.m. Omari was at his desk in the church office, working through the week's schedule. His assistant had just brought in coffee. Everything from the outside looked like a Tuesday. 4 federal agents and 2 IRS criminal investigators arrived at the church's main entrance. They were met by Raymond Foster and the church's legal counsel, who had been notified the previous evening. There was no scene in the lobby, no dramatic moment in front of staff. The board chair had ensured that much. Omari was asked to come to the conference room. He walked in and saw the agents, the documents on the table, the expression on Raymond's face. He sat down. He did not ask what it was about. He already knew. He had known, truly known, since the day he saw Audrey Cole's expression change over those spreadsheets. He had watched it happen from across the room, through the glass wall of his office. He had seen the exact moment she found the thread. He was charged with wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The indictment was 43 pages. It named Covenant Holdings, LLC, and 4 subsidiary companies. It detailed, transaction by transaction, 7 years of systematic theft from New Covenant Church, from its congregation, from its community programs, from its food bank, from its youth ministry. $2.3 million. Accounted for. Documented. Irrefutable. He was taken out through the back entrance. His assistant, who heard it from the legal team 20 minutes later, sat at her desk and didn't speak for the rest of the day. By noon, it was on the local news. By 6 p.m., it was national. And by Sunday, the Sunday he was not there to preach, 3,400 seats held the silence of people trying to understand how a man they had trusted with their grief, their marriages, their children, their money, had been, simultaneously, someone else, entirely. What happens to a congregation when the man at the center of it turns out to be a lie? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the real question, the human question, that gets buried under the headlines about wire fraud and indictments and sentencing hearings. The legal story of Omari Hightower is relatively straightforward. He was convicted on 12 of 14 charges. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He was ordered to pay restitution of $2.3 million. He surrendered the penthouse, the lake house, both vintage cars, and the contents of the shell company accounts. He drove the Honda to his sentencing hearing. Whether that was contrition or habit, nobody could tell anymore. But the human story is the one that deserves the time. Miss Patricia, the widow who had given her tithe faithfully for 12 years on a fixed income, told a local reporter she didn't leave the church. She said, "I didn't come here for Omari. I came here for God. And God didn't defraud me. A man did." Brother Terence Ellis took over as interim pastor the Sunday after the arrest. He didn't preach from a stage. He pulled a chair to the center of the floor, sat in it, and said, "I don't have a sermon today. I just want to sit with you, because you're hurting and I'm hurting, and I think today we just need to be here together." The congregation wept, and then, slowly, they began to talk, and then to pray, together, without a performance, without a production. The food bank kept running. A deacon named Carl Parker, who had been running it for 4 years, simply kept showing up at 5 a.m. every Saturday morning. 1,100 families kept getting fed. The youth ministry kept its 600 kids. 3 volunteer parents took over coordination. And Audrey Cole, who never sought a single moment of public recognition, who has declined every interview request, sent a letter to the board of New Covenant 3 months after the conviction. It said, simply, "What you build from here is what the community will remember. Not what was taken. What you do next. I want to sit with something before we close this story. Because it would be easy, too easy, to make Omari Hightower simply a villain, a fraudster in a collar, a cautionary tale about wolves in shepherd's clothing. And he is that. I'm not going to sanitize what he did. What he did was a betrayal of an order I genuinely struggle to put words to. He took money from grieving widows. He stole from children's ministries. He funded a penthouse with the tithes of people living on fixed incomes. Those are not abstract crimes. Those are real people who gave real sacrifice and had it stolen. But there is a more uncomfortable question underneath all of this that I cannot stop returning to. And it is this. How do we create the conditions that make an Omari Hightower possible? Because he didn't build that fraud alone. He built it inside a system of absolute trust. A system where questioning the pastor was culturally equivalent to questioning God. Where financial opacity was dressed up as faith. Where a man who drove a 10-year-old Honda could, through that single performative gesture, make an entire community stop asking the questions they should have been asking. The Honda was the cleverest thing he ever did. Not the shell companies, not the structuring, the Honda. Because the Honda said, I am not like those other men. You can trust me. And the congregation, who had been burned before, who had seen enough prosperity gospel fraud to be skeptical, looked at that battered old car and breathed out, and stopped looking. We do this with power. We do this with leadership. We find the one symbol of humility, and we allow it to stand in for character. And character, real character, cannot be performed. It can only be demonstrated, consistently, privately, in the choices nobody sees. Omari Hightower was excellent at the visible choices. The private ones destroyed him. Let that sit with you. That is the story of Omari Hightower, the fastest growing church in Memphis, Tennessee, and the secret that brought it all down. From the pulpit to a federal courtroom, from the Honda in the car park to a penthouse no one knew existed. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know. Did you see it coming? At what point in this story did you know? And what do you think about the congregation that chose to stay? Because I think that might be the most important part of the whole thing. If you are not subscribed to Corporate Chaos Scandals yet, do it now. Right now. Hit that like button. Share this with someone. We tell stories like this every single week. The ones that make you think, the ones that stay with you, the ones that ask the questions nobody else is asking. I'll see you in the next one.